We acknowledge the lands of the traditional custodians across Australia. We recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples' continuing connection to land, water and sky country. We acknowledge the wine regions and hundreds of different nations around this continent, and the ancient soils on which we stand and grow. From the Wadani saltwater peoples of the Margaret River in our west, to the East Coast Sunrise people of the Yuin Nation, and the Southern Island and Saltbush peoples of the Nioni peoples of Tasmania. Today and always, we pay our deep respects to the custodians, those who went before and those who will follow, as the knowledge holders of tomorrow. This is Australia.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Very, very excited to be here with what will be our global audience, somewhat global audience. It's in the middle of the night in Australia, so we don't have a lot of people tuning in, but we have people from Canada, East and West Coast, North America, US, East and West Coast, the UK, and throughout Europe. And I'm looking at all the people signing into the chat from Finland, from New York City. This is great. This is very, very exciting. Very, very happy to be here with my two guest panelists. Marianne Warbiek from the Wine Spectator. She is the Napa Bureau Chief from the Wine Spectator. And good morning, very early morning to you, Marianne. You are muted, I think, still. There
yeah, sorry. I was going to make a joke about how this should be a coffee tasting, but I haven't had enough coffee to make that joke yet. So let's leave.
Very pleased. 8 a.m. in Napa. So well done, Marianne. Much appreciated.
We'll edit that joke in later, right? Thank you.
Perfect. And of course, Oz Clark, who you've done a webinar with us before, a much more civilized time in the UK, but author, judge, broadcaster, still acting and singing, which is his original profession, and certainly a well-known critic of wine in general, but an absolute lover of Australian wine. So thrilled to have you back with us, Oz. And you said you used to be a bon vivant. I'm not really sure. I think you probably still are, but
well, it's wine o'clock.
There you go.
I've been waiting all day. Wine o'clock is a movable feast, but at this minute, with all these beautiful Australian Chardonnays just to my side, it is definitely wine o'clock.
Great. Okay, the usual obligatory housekeeping. So for all in the audience, you will see on your screen a chat, Q&A, handouts. Let me explain the differences. You're all beautifully using the chat. That's for you guys and girls to sort of, chat amongst yourselves and welcome everyone, which is fantastic. If you have a question, please throw it into the Q&A. We will be monitoring both, but if you've got a question for the panelists or about any of the subject matter here, throw it into the Q&A. And I will endeavor to answer those questions as we go along. I'm not a fan of waiting till the end. I feel like it's much better to address the questions because of the subject matter at the time and at hand, or if we have to push it to the end, I will mention that. Handouts, every single area or part of the world that has samples or indeed is tuning in, there are separate booklets you'll see in the handout for your ability to download. Gives you all the technical details, some overview of Chardonnay, and also various prices in the markets. I mean, estimated price, but certainly all the technical details. So that's the lovely housekeeping that we have to do. I really kind of don't like that word, but hey, I can't think of a better one. Now, why Chardonnay? There's all sorts of subjects that I find fascinating in with the situation of wines in Australia right now. I started back working more intensely with Australian wines. I was living overseas, but more intensely with Australian wines in 2009. And I certainly didn't think, even though I was paying attention, I didn't think 6 months into the job I was going to say, whoa, Chardonnay, super exciting. I was not paying attention to the evolution. And that was early days. And that's really what we're going to sort of address here. Now, it's a broad subject, and we're taking this narrative from sort of an outward facing, if you like, what made Australia famous for wine in general and also Chardonnay specifically, from what people were seeing overseas. There were all sorts of stories that could be talked about. The contributions of many estates in parts of Australia, Rothbury, Carr Estate, contributions from people like Brian Crozer. Certainly not wishing to do disservice to that, but it's really important. I think the narrative that we have today is really important for establishing what was happening with that variety. And in fact, drawing attention to Australian wine period. Everyone thinks, oh, Chardonnay, Australia, Shiraz is the famous variety. Actually, it wasn't Shiraz that put Australia on the map. It was Chardonnay. And we're going to look at those early iterations. And Oz was right in the thick of it there in the UK at the time, to where we sit today and why it has evolved into where it is. And a real simple 10,000-foot view is that the early iterations of Chardonnay from Australia were generally from warm climates. They were big, they were bold. Structural complexity might have taken a backseat to pineapple-y forward fruit, and we loved them. We couldn't gargle them down fast enough at the time, but they did. There was a little bit of an argument that, well, these wines are a bit heavy. So moving to cooler climates, moving to sites within those cooler climates, understanding the plant material that was coming in, and frankly, recognizing that the techniques we all love that shape great Chardonnay anywhere on the planet has to be used judiciously. Oak is a maturation vessel, not just a flavoring compound. So we've done a really good job at that. And I think it's, there was definitely, and I know what Oz will address it, there's definitely some periods where you got to turn the dial up to 11 to realize it needed to be at 8. And that happened in the evolution of Chardonnay from Australia. But there's never been a better time to be experiencing it. And we've given you, I believe, a wonderful snapshot. So with that, we're gonna lead off with Oz, because he's going to tell the story about Rosemount Show Reserve Chardonnay that turned everyone's head in 1982. It was 1981? No, 1981. 1980 Show Reserve in London in 1981. Take it away, Oz.
Well, Mark, one thing I'm going to do before then, I've delved into the depths of my library and come up with this. This is a 1971 wine list from John Harvey, who at that time was one of the greatest wine merchants in the country. And I'm looking at the contents list. Fortified wines, 10 pages of them. French wines, 18 pages of them. 6 pages of German wines. And then other table wines, 2 pages of them. Oh, let's have a look at those. Other table wines. Chilean, good God. Italian is other table wines. Spanish is other table wines. Portuguese, there's one of them. That's other table wines. Yugoslav, there's one of them. That's other table wines. And then nothing. Australia, it could be the communion wine. It could be the communion wine. Otherwise, 1971, a really good wine merchant. Australia, nothing. So, and that was what it was like 50 years ago. We say, what was wine like in the UK 50 years ago? Well, I tell you what, we'd been starved of ripeness by our European friends for about 1,000 years, and there was no decent, cheap wine. We had the scrapings of Europe's most unsavory barrels and tanks. They seemed to find their dismal ways to our shores. There was nothing worth drinking. Hey, but what was wine like in Australia 50 years ago? I don't know. But Australia 48 years ago, I can tell you, because I went there as an actor with the Royal Shakespeare Company 48 years ago. And night after night, I went off to the local bottle shops and I bought the cheapest wines on the rack. And they were wonderful because there was a popular wine revolution just starting in Australia that meant everybody from the taxi driver to the stagehands at the theatre to the wharfies in the pub down by the Sydney harbour front was enjoying wine, was talking about wine, and was having opinions about it. Well, why didn't we have a popular wine culture in Britain? Because we didn't have any decent popular wine. Our cheap wine was raw, bitter, and bad-tempered. No wonder hardly any Brits drank wine. And I came back to Britain convinced that if we could get basic wines half as good as these Butte Aussies, we could become a wine-drinking nation. Well, we had to wait a few more years because 48 years ago, the glittering golden nectar that was going to grab us Brits gleefully by the throat and drag us kicking and giggling into a world of wine fun hadn't been invented. It's difficult to believe, but 50 years ago, there wasn't any Chardonnay in Australia. Oh, there were a few stray vines in New South Wales, and one guy, Murray Tyrrell, had taken time off from making blackberry nip to try and turn the Chardonnay into decent grog. However, by the beginning of the 1980s, the juicy juggernaut of joy that was Aussie Chardonnay began to roll northwards towards our shores. First, just a few droplets, and then a dribble, and then a flood of heady, indulgent, golden liquid began to cascade onto our ripeness-deprived shores. And this wonderful, peachy, lush, seductive, happy juice from down under was simply labelled Chardonnay. And once we learned that,
I feel like we need to just end right there because I don't think I'm just so happy right now. But no, sorry, go.
How am I supposed to follow this?
I mean, I've got all this stuff about VAT 47 and all this. I
meant we just end the seminar. I'm leaving now because this is just magnificent.
Yeah, well, I think you need to drop the mic and walk out the room right now. I mean, you pretty much you win. So
we've only just started, because I mean, once we actually in this country learned that Chardonnay was a grape variety, because people thought it was a village in Australia for a while. And then they discovered that this grape variety had just one single, simple objective: to offer us pleasure. And it didn't demand respect or obeisance, and it didn't require we understood it, and it didn't demand more money than we could afford. Well, we couldn't get enough of it. And I think it is fair to say that Aussie Chardonnay taught Britain how to become a wine-drinking nation. Now, in the 1970s, 1980s, most of Britain was of the belief that, wine's not for the likes of us. Well, if this lovely, juicy, warm-hearted fruit bomb called Chardonnay was wine, well, millions of people who said, wine's not for the likes of us, thought that perhaps wine was for the likes of them, and that perhaps they could become wine drinkers after all. And they did. And from my point of view as a tub-thumping evangelist for the joys of Aussie grog, as I'd experienced it down under, what was thrilling beyond belief was that Aussie Chardonnay always over-delivered. Once the bottles began arriving in their shiploads, these wines weren't just cheap as chips. In fact, they weren't cheap. They asked for a fair price, but they made the promise that whatever price you paid, the wine would over-deliver on flavor in your mouth and pleasure in your soul. And there were 3 wines of enormous importance in that first wave. 2 of them from New South Wales, followed by 1 from Victoria and South Australia. And the first was Tyrrell's VAT 47 Chardonnay from the Hunter Valley. Now, we'll be tasting a modern version of it a little bit later. And it's a fantastic wine nowadays, among many fantastic Australian Chardonnays. But when I first tasted it, VAT 47 was one of only 2 Chardonnays on the British High Street. And it had a day-glow, yellow-green colour, and it was as viscous as heavenly engine oil. I remember describing it as having a sensual, clinging texture that swirled lazily round the glass like a courtesan interrupted during her siesta. And it had a flavour of peaches and honey and hazelnuts and wood smoke and lime that sent stars bursting over my palate. That was where it started. And the other Chardonnay we had was Rosemount Show Reserve. That's another Hunter Valley wine. It was put together by a retired coffee planter with an eye to the main chance, who used a whacked out old Penfold winery and some grapes from a thistle-strewn patch of vivid red soil pushing up against a deep blue sky. Roxburgh, this patch of Chardonnay gold was called, and for a brief flash, it was the most famous vineyard in Australia. Now it's a coal mine, but times change. But in 1982, a spicy, syrupy, gobful of joy, tasting of Brazil nut cream and peaches and honey and fresh burnt toast, and crafted out of Roxburgh grapes, won a double gold medal in London. Show Reserve from Rosemount had arrived. And Bob Oatley, the coffee guy, he had no idea what he'd started. But as he stood on Westminster Bridge at midnight, clutching his award and listening to Big Ben chime 12, he said, "We'd better have a go at this." And he did. And following on from these two, something more unashamedly commercial, less ambitious, but just as important, since the volumes were massive and the quality, the angelica and cinnamon spice, the peach and apple fruit, and the seeming hint of gentle sweetness, part honey, part melted butter. Now, this really did teach the Brits to love white wine. And that was Lindeman's Bin 65. One of the most impressive and important white wines from anywhere in the world in the last 50 years. And if popular white wine was going to be as good as this, all the old cobwebs of wine snobbery and elitism could be blown away as the friendliest, most easygoing white wine in the world cascaded onto our shores and down our gullets. And that's how it started.
Brilliant. And I don't even know what to say at this particular point that's going to sound even remotely as impressive as that. But I will say, though, that as a young sommelier and for probably 15 years in various parts of Canada, I was actually living and working in Canada. Bin 65 was on by the glass almost everywhere I went for a period of time, not because I was Australian, but because it absolutely delivered. It was a perfect by the glass pour and delivered all those things you just said, because I can't possibly match you this. But yeah, it's a really interesting, and I think as you know, for the audience, as you've seen, the style that Oz is talking about was very much full flavored, rich, but that's kind of what the early drinking wine palates wanted at the time. And I think it's fair to say that over a decade or two, there was a little bit of, wine and food culture started to evolve a little differently. They weren't just drinking wines. You go, oh, some of these wines might be a little on the heavy side. So, how can this change? But I think, and Mary, I don't know if you were as much aware of Bin 65. I can't remember if it was such a big wine. It was a big wine still in the US too, wasn't it? I wasn't in the US.
Yeah, absolutely. And Rosemount and definitely they had a big presence. And by the way, you guys, I completely understand my role here is to finish talking as quickly as possible so we can get back to Oz. I think from the American perspective, the Chardonnay had the most dramatic evolution. Of Aussie wines, there was that influx of, kind of caricature, over-oaked and overripe wines, and the pendulum swung way over to the other side. And then there was a mass of unwooded examples, and they were all affordable. It was, fun to do some experimentation, but, I think as everywhere in the world, the pendulum has kind of landed somewhere in the middle now, which is for everyone's benefit. I do want to mention, and sure, we were bashing Australia for its Chardonnay examples on both sides of that pendulum swing. Phil Sexton taught me most of. We'll try some wines from a brand that he founded later, but he founded two brands based with a reputation in Chardonnay at two different points in his career. But he told me once, Australia was bashed for their Chardonnay style. We thought they were clapping because they wanted more Australian Chardonnay, but they were clapping because they had enough. So certainly it did feel that from my perspective, Aussie Chardonnay was kind of following a lot of the trends that were happening in the world.
Yeah, and I love that pendulum swing comment, because right when I was starting with Wine Australia, the pendulum was there, and there was some wines where leanness was the most applauded at the time, keeping on the clapping theme, and to the point where if you actually stop and think about it, unwooded Chardonnays, I feel a bit, okay, there's maybe some good examples. You say, what about Chablis? Well, actually, if you look at the top Chablis, they see wood of some kind. Usually it's old wood. And so, but I think the critical piece of the puzzle for me about great Chardonnay, no matter where it's from, including great Chablis, texture and there's weight behind or supporting whatever the acid structure is. And I think that's the critical piece with Chardonnay, is that you want that texture, you want that complexity and that weight. And I think we had to sort of come back. But hey, you know, movements happen like that. It's good. Oh, look what we can do. We're making a Chablis style. Well, you're not in Chablis, so stop. Make a good expression in that. And we're at that point now. And I think that's cool. So yeah, pendulum swings, I think they're important, even though they're open, ripe for criticism at those, when you've turned it up to 11. But let's have a look, get back to the wines. Now, for those, clearly not everyone in the audience around the globe has wine samples. It's just not possible for us to do. But for those of you that do, I'm hoping you're already starting to taste. But let's head back to one of the wines that I think is one of the more important wines, because really, from the Brits' perspective and from the trade, it was Rosemount Show Reserve that got everyone's attention about Australian wine. For the customers in the UK, it was Bin 65, and then probably followed very quickly by Jacobs Creek's Chardonnay, I would imagine. Yeah. But realistically, the narrative, to my mind, starts with the first varietally bottled Chardonnay ever produced in Australia. I know in our discussions we talk about 50 years, we talk about a wine at Craigmore, but the reality is that wine's not nearly as commercially available. Plus Tyrrell's was 1 year earlier, but as Oz might have mentioned, it was labeled Pinot Chardonnay because at a brief moment in history, people thought it was part of the Pinot family. That is incorrect, but that's how it was labeled, and that's technically the first varietally labeled Chardonnay in Australia. So let's launch off on that one, Oz, and get that into your glass, and hopefully, as Oz, you said, get it into your gullet. Only you can pull off that word as comfortably as you did.
Gullet. I couldn't resist just having a taste of that. Of course, it is massively different from the first VAT 47. But as Bruce Tyrrell said, and he should know, the story of Chardonnay in Australia is constant evolution. And the very early 1971 VAT 47, from what he tells me, was a much leaner kind of wine. By the 1980s, they got this massive, wonderful ebullient style, which is the style that I first came across. And it's well, you were saying Australia follows trends. Australia makes trends. Australia's not a great follower. Australia's a great maker. And that's why the pendulum swings so madly, rather. I remember tasting 10 or 12 years ago Chardonnays at 10.8% alcohol, which were getting gold medals in the shows. And me saying to the winemakers, but have you ever met a member of the public? You can't drink this stuff. Oh, it's a gold medal wine. No. Have you met a member of the public? This is undrinkable. No, gold medal wine. It's won all the shows. Excuse me, shall I say it again? Have you ever met a member of the public? You can't drink this stuff. And I agree with Marianne. I'm so glad now that we've got back at the pendulum seems to be calming down in the middle with some sensational styles. And this VAT 47 is one of them. This VAT 47, this is basically the wine that launched my television career, because I went on to do a blind tasting show as a young actor at 24 hours notice, and they just said, you got to go, and there's an audience there, and there's 9 million people watching it, and it's live and all the rest. And I just looked at this wine, and it was lazily swirling around in a thick golden way in the glass. And I just thought, hey, there were only 2 Australian Chardonnays in England at the time. There were no other wines that looked like Australian Chardonnays. I had a 50-50 chance of saying it's either VAT 47, I get 100 points, or it's Rosemount Show Reserve. I chose VAT 47. It was VAT 47. Everyone thought I was a genius. I wasn't. It's just that there were only 2 Australian Chardonnays. I was doing a 50-50, and I chose the right one. But today's VAT 47 doesn't taste a bit like that VAT 47, and it doesn't look like it either, because that was deep golden stuff. But it still does come from 100% Hunter fruit. In fact, the short flat vineyard where the Chardonnay comes from is still based on a vineyard planted with cuttings from a little place called Penfolds Hunter Valley Distillery Vineyard, which Murray Tyrrell, he'd gone over the fence and nicked it. Well, he actually says he took his ute round late at night and half-filled the ute. Either he did that or he got his poacher's coat on, he climbed over the fence, cut as much cuttings off as he could from the vines that weren't his, and planted them in this short, flat vineyard. And that was in 1968. And by 1971, they'd picked the first crop of Chardonnay, they'd fermented it, they'd got hold of a barrel, and they threw the wine in for a bit of a soak. And then they bottled it and they entered it in the prestigious Brisbane Wine Show. And it got marked 6 marks out of 20. Now, in Australian show terms, that puts it somewhere between battery acid and cider vinegar. As Tyrrell said, he said, even the spit bucket got 8. But the chairman of the judges had it right. He said, either this wine is volatile and oxidized, or it's the greatest white wine I've ever seen in Australia. And by the end of that year, the VAT 47 1971 was winning trophies, and it's never stopped. And without any question, this was the wine that led the way for that remarkable phenomenon that is Australian Chardonnay. And it has moved with the times, but it's still unmistakably, when you put that in your mouth, it's still unmistakably warm climate fruit. That's a style often derided by the cool dudes. And I would say, well, then why have so many great Aussie whites come from the positively subtropical Hunter? Because, what is this with the Hunter? It's near Sydney. That's the main reason. I mean, honestly, if it weren't near Sydney, no one would have planted it. But it's about the first place out of Sydney that you can vaguely successfully sort of grow grapes. But it's a very capricious place. It is not a logical place to grow grapes. Now, the soil is mostly pallid yellow pug clay. Many people have tried to plant it, and they have absolutely failed to get a crop off it. The great Rothbury was one of the classic examples. You can't get a crop off it. The short flat, on the other hand, is on sandy loams, and wherever you find these soils, they're packed with vines. There just aren't very many of them. And as Murray Tyrrell said, that most of the decent Hunter soil has been washed into Newcastle Harbour centuries ago. Now, the climate, again, why would you plant? It's almost exactly opposite of what you might think if you're talking in sort of Bordeaux and Burgundy terms. Patterns of sunshine and rainfall virtually reversed. Sunshine, it's at 32 degrees latitude. That is almost 11 degrees latitude warmer than Tasmania. So you'd actually think, there'll be much too much sun. Well, there's often too much heat. But regular as clockwork, during the ripening season, a cloud cover builds up in the afternoons and it shields the grapes. It's still hot, it's still humid, but there's no direct sun. It's what the French would call terroir. Water. It's subtropical. There should be lots of water. Well, yeah, sort of. You sort of want lots of winter rains. You maybe want some spring rains, a bit of summer rain, but not autumn. Well, the Hunter's total rainfall is quite average. It's much the same as the Adelaide Hills. The trouble is you're very likely to get drought all through the winter when you desperately need rain, and droughts becoming commonplace in the summer too. And the biggest deluges are likely to be the autumnal cyclones, which batter Australia's east coast all too often nowadays, usually just before your grapes are ripe. And that's just to even things out with the threat of forest fires, which were so fierce in 2020 that for the only time since 1971, no VAT 47 was made. But anyway, I'm wittering on again. I'm desperate for
beautiful stuff. Yeah, no, and we're getting some lovely comments here, and it's I think it might be a bit of a surprise to some people because I think Hunter was known for Chardonnay, and then more the narrative around Hunter nowadays tends to be around Semillon Shiraz. But it's important to note if you know where to go and what to look for, and this being one of them. The Hunter Valley, the HVD vineyard site you're talking about, wasn't a Tyrrell's property originally. It was planted with Chardonnay, and they've now sort of whip the Chardonnay into shape, and they use it and they bottle it as a separate bottling now. 1908, those vines were first planted. I feel like, and Bruce told me this, I think it's the oldest Chardonnay, certainly the oldest Chardonnay vineyard in Australia. I think it might be one of the oldest on the planet right now because of phylloxera and elsewhere. It's probably one of the oldest. So they now do a bottling of it. I actually have a bottle here as a separate bottling. But in the early days, it was planted for distillery, and because it was a white grape. But now they've shaped it into something fun. So that's cool. The next wine, I'm going to let Marianne talk to, simply because if you look over the last 2 decades, arguably the most awarded area in Australia by Australian judges, and certainly within the internal show system in Australia. The most awarded Chardonnays have been coming out of Margaret River, and there's a wonderful story because it's a bit of a newcomer to the fine wine scene. Margaret River being really only planted early in being planted in the late 60s. Chardonnay sort of hit its straps in the mid 70s, and one of the legendary producers and probably most awarded in Australia, never mind most awarded at the Wine Spectator, would be Lewin's Art Series. And you're a massive fan, so take it away. Let's have a look at Lewin.
Yeah, thank you. So Dennis and Tricia Horgan were some of the pioneers that were first planting Chardonnay in Margaret River in 1976. And of course, the Indian Ocean is right there, bringing a maritime influence to what is essentially a Mediterranean climate. So they kind of have the best of both worlds there. Ocean was what attracted Dennis to the area, not for grapes, but because he wanted to surf. And he got some good advice from a California vintner named Robert Mondavi, who came out and told him, you really should keep this piece of property that you bought and you should plant some grapes here. And it's kind of nice that we have a bit of a relationship there between California and us to help develop this area. I think this is one of the most distinctive Chardonnays I taste, and certainly the scores reflect that. But basically, it's kind of a culmination of every single terrific Chardonnay I've ever had in one glass. It's everything I want in a Chardonnay, and everything is done with such precision and focus. Having visited Margaret River, it is really amazing that they've figured out that they can grow and make terrific, distinctive Chardonnays there and Cabernets there, and really what the region is doing as a whole is simple fine tuning. In the case of Lewin, when I visited a few years ago, they were talking about a program they were doing where they were taking water pressure meters to every single stave of a barrel, just to see and make sure that the barrels they were getting were the quality that they needed, and giving that feedback to the barrel producers. I mean, that's sort of the level of the thought that they're putting into things. And I just think this is just a wine that's just truly singing.
It's crazy, and I love it because there's always been a Lewin style, which I think has been adjusted a little bit. But one of the interesting things is, if we talk about the evolution of Chardonnay and techniques being used for Chardonnay, one of the things that has changed is use of oak. A lot less percentage of new oak, bigger barrels, better quality oak, and the better quality oak is what you just spoke to. However, Lewin Art Series is 100% new oak. One of the very few that are still doing that. And I taste this wine now, and you go, yeah, I see the oak in here, but the reality is the power of the fruit, which is the hallmark of Margaret River, can stand it. And it certainly is really interesting. And I think that's a lovely sort of discussion, because of all across the country, what I'm seeing, and I'm hoping it will show here, it's already shown in the Tyrrell's wine, which is proper use of wood that's commensurate with the quality of the fruit, the intensity of the fruit. And I think this is a wonderful example. And I have romantic attachments for this particular wine, of which I cannot speak, but for sure, I lived in Vancouver, British Columbia, and I tell this story all the time. And the best crab on the planet, sorry, don't want to offend crab fishermen around the world, Dungeness crab from the West Coast, fresh, boiled, butter, dipped in butter with this Chardonnay, is categorically one of the most magical things you can ever experience. And I've done it with all my wine wanker friends, with Puligny Montrachet, with California Chard. This is the wine. This is the wine.
Yeah.
So,
and absolutely, to your point, they absolutely have gone through an evolution. But if you look back at some of the older wines, which I've been lucky enough to taste, I mean, there's something really special about what they're doing there, and they are definitely aging very well.
But they really have changed, haven't they? They used to be called the Montrachet of Australia, which was a very useful phrase at the time. It's no longer particularly required. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind, though, that they have quietly. I remember talking to Dennis Horgan about 10 years ago, and he said, I suppose I'm going to have to ease up a little bit.
That's what he
And you
says.
could sort of see him with a twinkle in his eyes there, but not very much. But in fact, they've eased up quite a lot. And I think things like the acidity and the way that 100% oak is integrated into this wine is fantastic. And they've got that bread crust and they've got that lovely lemon flower. But what I'm interested at this is what, 13.5% alcohol. That right the way through all the various sorts of richness and creaminess and truffliness come through within a young wine. But eventually what is persistent and glorious at the finish is a pith and citrus kind of finish that just goes on and on and on, and it makes your mouth water long after you've swallowed the wine. And that's
it is a very magical wine, and I think it speaks to Margaret River still, because there is that powerful fruit, but there's this lime-like acidity. I always remember drinking it once thinking, well, it's kind of like key lime pie. It's got this limey fruit, and the oak is the sort of the crust of the key lime pie. It's just magical wine, and it really is year in, year out, one of those wines where, because when I try wines like this, you go, okay, come on, is this as good as everyone keeps talking about? And every time I try it, it's like, yeah, damn it, it is. It really is a delicious wine. Loving the comments here and from Richard Banfield saying, the effortless ease with way this wine absorbs the oak, and that's such a nice way to put it, because it really does absorb it. And you think, wow, because blind you'd go, if you didn't know the wine, you'd 100% new oak. I don't think so, and sure enough, it is. And I think that's a magical wine.
Me too, and I think it's a great example of Australian wines. They didn't really have to change too much if they didn't want to. They don't need gold medals. They don't need to enter competitions. But they said, hey, we're about evolution in this country. And I suppose it's almost as though they're saying, if you want to stay still, you've got to keep changing.
Yes, and this is pulled back from the earlier things. Maybe it's I think that the approaches are the same. It might be a harvest thing. I haven't really had a good chat. Maybe Marianne. I think it's harvest. I picked a bit.
Yeah,
earlier.
I mean, long story short, they're picking earlier, but yeah, and just being a little more precise in making more judicious decisions that way. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, attention to detail. Boy, when I visited, the first time I visited, they had just gone back to all their library stock, understanding that, they've got a fair bit in stock because this wine ages beautifully. Took everything that was in cork, pulled all the corks out, checked them, rebottled them in screw cap. Going back to the 80s. Not that they bottled them initially, but they went back and thought, that's a pretty ambitious project. So that's their attention to detail absolutely is there. Okay, mindful of time here. No questions just yet, just fantastic comments, there is a Q&A. I'll carry on. Let's move to the next one. Forest Hill. Have a chat about this. We're actually it's still in the same sort of area of Australia over on the west coast, but down in an area called Great Southern.
I must admit, I think this shows the chalk and the cheese of Western Australia, because Lewin, although this was a brilliantly balanced Lewin, has always had a bit of a reputation for a full-throated kind of style. And indeed, Margaret River Chardonnay has often been thought of in that way. But this one here, the Forest Hill, comes from Mount Barker, and that's in the far south of Western Australia. It's an area which is much less well-known than Margaret River. But if the experts had their way, these bleak, empty acres down towards the old whaling station of Albany, barely protected from the harsh chill of the Southern Ocean, they would have been the cool climate showcase of the West, and not Margaret River. But those words, bleak, empty acres, way down south, these are probably the reason that Margaret River, much closer to Perth, and with a reasonable number of people living within striking distance, got the nod. And Margaret River has proved to be a wonderful place to grow grapes. But Professor Olmo from Davis in California, as early as 1955, had recommended that the best place to grow grapes in Western Australia was down at Franklin River and Mount Barker. And that is way down south. But one visit to this vast, empty place, even today, it makes you pause. This wild landscape of mighty jarrah and red gum trees, this barely tameable scrub, these sudden gaunt great outcrops of rearing granite, and no people. I mean, none. Who's going to buy your wine? Well, a friend of mine was a winemaker down there, and he eventually moved to New Zealand, saying he just couldn't live where you had to drive an hour and a half to get a cappuccino. Well, Forest Hill is the original Great Southern Vineyard. They started coping with the lack of rain and the lack of heat and the icy nights of way down south in 1965. Betting, by the way, on the fact that since this was one of Australia's chief apple growing areas, it might be okay for wines. And Block 8, which is where our wine comes from, wasn't planted till 1985, but that's seriously mature. And since these are all dry farmed, these are dry farmed in an area which is very dry. They're dry farmed. And again, you'll find that most of our wines today are dry farmed. But this is very, very ambitious in an area like Great Southern, where harvesting winter rains for irrigation is a major activity. And the vines, therefore, take a long time to establish themselves. And the clay base, which these vineyards have to hold whatever winter rain comes along, is absolutely crucial. But when the vines do establish themselves, they don't give up, as the still healthy 1965 plantations at Forest Hill show. I must admit, when I was on my last visit down there to Great Southern, I thought to myself, this could be as cool, as important a cool climate area as New Zealand's Marlborough, if only it had enough water. Well, up till now, it doesn't. So volumes are never high, but quality really is. But do you see how this one is so juicy, so crisp, so much sharper, but still with tons and tons of a completely different sort of flavor in your mouth?
Yeah, it's a really beautiful wine. And just to correct you there, we don't use the word New Zealand on these webinars ever, Oz. It's a swear word. I'm not sure
you wouldn't, but I thought I'd throw it in anyway, because I was saying that it could have done better than New Zealand. Hey, that means you and I have used the word twice. So I'll slap my own wrist. I've slapped my wrist.
So I was down in the Great Southern. I've never been before, and I was down there with a group of sommeliers and trade from the US. I had to admit, I didn't know much about Forest Hill when we visited, and it was one of those moments for everyone on the trip where like, whoa, oh, hang on a minute, have you tried these Chardonnays? And we were tasting some barrel samples at first, and then the bottled wines. It was wow, okay, hang on a second here. And that's why I was happy to include this, because it is available in different parts of the world. But he was very happy to send these wines out. This particular wine wasn't available in the US. The regular bottlings are, and I'm not sure about in the UK and Europe. But he was very happy to say, no, well, I'm happy to send this to various parts of the world, because I tell you what, I'm with you on this, Oz. This is a really important style and a really, really significant wine. And it's showing, as I remember, and as drew the attention of all these MSs that were standing around going, hang on a second, this is fantastic. So cool, really cool stuff.
It's got a fantastic smell, like lemon sherbet and lemon oil mixed in. Wonderful aromatics that lemon oil comes up with. And the flavors, there's tons and tons of greenness about it, but it's not just unripe leafy greenness. It's like mint leaves. It's like peaches, which are still slightly green. And and there's something, there's something like very dry but cool earth running through it as well. And maybe that's these very difficult soils that you have down in the Great Southern, which are pretty bony soils. And yet there's enough spice, there's enough richness there, but the overall feeling is something full of flavor, marvelously balanced, but seriously cool.
But in a great example of what we talked about earlier, because you talked about those really lean wines, and I jokingly said to someone, did you, years ago when we were trying some battery acid Chardonnay, I said, oh, did you pick this before Veraison? That didn't go over very well. But the point is, it was really tight. I look at this and look at that acid structure and look at the texture of fruit around that acid spine, and that to me is charming Chardonnay, even though it's along the lines of a much leaner, but it's still got the texture, still got the weight, which is what we want. Marianne, what did you think?
This was my first time trying it, and I like, as you mentioned, it's not available in the US, and I was really, really impressed. In fact, the first three wines, I'm just struck with how much intensity they all have. I mean, my eyes are watering a little bit first thing this morning, in a good way, because they really they all have such a presence too. They're not trying to be, you know, hidden in the middle of the pack here. These are wines that are trying to they have something to say.
Yeah, this is great.
They have early picked as well, Mark. They pick at February 24. That's quite early for Great Southern.
It is quite early. I'd be lying if I said I knew what was going on in the 18 vintage down there. But yeah, that does seem a bit early even prior to given normal conditions. But yeah, it is quite early. But it's phenolically ripe, that's for sure. It's just a lovely style.
And you look at that acid at 8.3, and you look at that pH at 3.15, and yet it's not extreme at all. It's and sugar is presumably close to zero. 8.3 acid, 3.15 pH, and sugar close to zero. That's serious good fruit.
That's German. That's German Riesling numbers.
Yeah. plus some sugar.
Right.
Yeah,
exactly. No, lovely stuff. Now we're onto certainly a name most people are familiar with, maybe not quite as familiar with this wine, and it has had some different iterations, but onto Penfolds. Marianne, tell us a bit about this wine.
Yeah. Hey, listen, you know, Penfolds has access to a lot of vineyards and a lot of great grapes, and their whole approach to wine is to kind of, you know, start with the whether it's Chardonnay, to kind of start with their flagship, which is the Yatarna, you know, pick the best grapes they want. Well, this is like the little sister to the Yatarna, and they do that across all of their programs. You know, they have a style that they're trying to get, and they, you know, pick, you know, do special selections and blendings to get there. And because they're such a, you know, a big presence, you know, they have a lot to choose from, and you will find a lot of consistency from year to year. So, anyway, I find their Chardonnay program very, very interesting. They've definitely been embracing the cooler climate Chardonnays. So I know this wine at one point was a single source of Tumbarumba fruit, but you know, essentially, which is of course one of the highest altitude vineyards in Australia. And now it's expanded to a multi-regional blend. And stylistically, this is pure, cool climate with, you know, as little filtration as possible to preserve the elegance. Again, this is fermented 100% in French oak barrels. So if you find that oak in there, you let me know, okay? And I do find it just a really crisp, clean. You know, the acidity is just keeping the flavors very pure here. So.
It is richer in the mouth, though, isn't it? I mean, I feel as though
fair enough, yeah.
It's got really good, high quality, cool climate fruit, but it's still a Penfolds wine. And now this is one of the things, of course, that we should hold up about Australian wines with honor and respect. That an operation like Penfolds can still say, we'll follow trends, we'll lead trends, but we're still making a Penfoldy wine, and there's a roundness and a warmth in that wine, despite the fruit coming from some seriously cool places, that just says Penfolds to me.
Yeah, I think that's true. Now, this used to be from a single GI of Tumbarumba, yep, which rolls off the tongue quite easily, but which is a very basically foothills of the Alps, and the New South Wales side, foothills of the Alps in Australia, but they are doing more what Penfolds does, which is accessing high quality fruit from growers in various parts of the country. There's some Tasmania in here. I was meant to check the tech sheets, but it's a conglomeration of all cool climate fruit. But you see the style, and you see, and the question is, why would they choose to blend it? It's just that's always been Penfolds' approach to almost all of their wines, with the exception of a few, which is, hey, we have access to and we'll pay good money for the best quality fruit we can do, that not only expresses the vintage of that particular year, but also this is our style. This is what we're trying to shape. And I think, as Oz mentioned, you tip your hat to that. I mean, we all grew up as wine geeks. We grew up with this idea about single sites and different places and how they express themselves. But there's a lot to be said for a style that is still 100% contemporary, but 100% Penfolds. And that's not easy to walk, that type road.
Yeah, and it might be, you know, climate change might be a factor in here. But yeah, so now it's a blend of Adelaide Hills, Tumbarumba, and Tasmania. And, you know, what do they all share is the cool climate. But again, you know, the idea is that they have so much flexibility in their vineyard sourcing that they can maintain style from year to year. And it's just it's not better or worse than a single vineyard expression. It's just your approach to making wine. And I really applaud that. And Yeah, and to do it at the volume they're doing it at is very, very impressive.
I agree. And there's one more thing, that this is the first wine which has undergone malolactic. The first three wines didn't do malolactic. This one has. And again, it sort of shows how malolactic is being so much better handled now than it used to be. Because mine, I mean, I might say, oh, this is a bit rounder and a bit fuller than the first three, but I wouldn't immediately pick up any sort of malolactic component whatsoever. And it's 100%.
And that's a lovely, and that's a really good time. We haven't talked about other techniques, and I think that's something that has evolved over time as well, which is it's not a formulaic approach in Australia, as it isn't anywhere for high quality wines. But there was this decades where it was all about the winemaker, and it was all about techniques, and wines were being made to not a recipe as much, but hey, we've got to pick at this number, we've got to do this at this number, and I'll steal from Virginia. Wilcock at Vas Feliz, because she said in the early days we looked to Burgundy and we tried to do what Burgundy was doing, get it as ripe as possible, full Malo, and then we all had to just stop back and go realize that actually ripeness is not an issue for most of our sites. We need to manage ripeness. That means going to cooler sites. We don't need full Malo. We need to do Malo when we need to do it, and sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. And that's the approach now. And then we get into the lees pit too. Let's work the lees, and you can try wines nowadays from any part of the world that's Chardonnay based with lees working. You go, well, that's sometimes a bit too heavy, so that becomes a dominant technique. And you see all this stuff is now background noise. Oz, with your singing and theatre background, that's the stuff needs to be background noise, and the fruit needs to be singing. And I think that's a good case. And someone made a comment about, with all these numbers, all these wines adjusted. Look, I can't say for sure. And remember, we don't acidify in Australia. We pH adjust. That's the winemaker's technique. But those things happen from time to time. But what I'm seeing nowadays is far less of that, tweaking from time to time in a challenging vintage, mostly not doing that at all, adjusting picking times as opposed to post picking and making adjustments. Not saying it doesn't happen, but for the most part, the better quality wines, it's a lot less of that happening. Watching time here a little bit. We are going to move to the next wine, which is Murdoch. Now, this was not available in Canada. So for our Canadian audience, you have the Montalto wine. Oz is going to speak to the Murdoch wine. We managed to get a bottle of the Montalto down to Marianne, so she can make some comments on that, and I'll talk a bit about Montalto. But Oz, lead off with the Murdoch wine.
I think here, again, this is another 100% malolactic wine, and it really shows what Mornington Peninsula is about, because Mornington Peninsula is where Murdoch is, and Mornington is part of what they call the dress circle, and this is a ring of fabulous cool climate zones that create a ring around Melbourne. You've got Geelong to the west, you've got Yarra Valley to the northeast, and you've got Mornington Peninsula to the southeast, and yet Yarra Valley's made itself world famous, and Mornington Peninsula hasn't. Why? Well, the chief reason is it's really nice down there on the peninsula, and you've got Melbourne, which is a great and prosperous city of 3 million people, and its nearest area of great beaches and gentle hillsides and tranquility is the Mornington Peninsula. And what do you want? You want vines or you want holiday homes? Well, so far they're just about managing both, but if pushed, I'd still back the holiday homes to win out. Now, most of the peninsula is pretty cool country. It's tucked in between Port Phillip Bay and the icy Southern Ocean. And the first vineyards there were established on high ground, at places like the Red Hill, where there are still lots of vineyards to this day. And that's where it's sufficiently cold that you really can't always fully ripen your grapes, even today. But if you want to know why the early grape growers planted on the high ground, you only have to sit in the evening sun at somewhere like Stonia, gazing out past the vineyards to the bright blue water at the mouth of Western Port Bay, and watch the sailboats gallantly dodging the white horses of waves breaking on the reef, and you sip a little more Chardonnay, and then it all makes sense. Well, one or two of these pioneers were less concerned about the view, and they planted a little bit closer to Melbourne and a little further away from the Southern Ocean and a little lower down. And all of this means and a little warmer. You've got people like Dramana, you've got people nowadays like Yabby Lake, and you've got Murdoch. Now, Murdoch started out as a 2-hectare family winery in 1982 when Richard McIntyre needed a backup in case his career as a surgeon folded. Here we got another doctor. What is it about doctors and Australian wine? So many vineyards are started by doctors in Australia. Anyone says wine's not good for you, say, go and ask an Australian doctor. He'll tell you. Well, anyway, it's now a highly successful family estate. And the calling card is natural, not in a didactic way, just, well, unobtrusively, as natural as you can manage. Wild yeast ferments, yep. Warmish ferments, yep, because the fruit quality is so strong in Mornington Peninsula, they actually think, I need to reduce this a little bit. Natural malolactic in French oak. If it comes, it comes. Low sulfurs, but not no sulfurs. And drinkability. I must say, drinkability is what the northern part of the Mornington Peninsula do brilliantly well. And the McIntyres, they haven't been too bothered by numerous trends in Chardonnay making over the last decade. They really don't, because the Mornington Peninsula has always been about pleasure, first and foremost, in its wine and in its holiday homes. And I think this is a wine softer, rounder, gentler than anything we've had so far. Pleasurable, slightly fat in the mouth, but in a chubby, not fat, slightly chubby, but in just an utterly friendly, come hither kind of way. And we're not talking about a wine which is in any way compromising its quality. I think this is tremendous quality wine, but it's not made in an intellectual, sharply aggressive way. It's made in a way saying, hey, we know how to make wine here. We've got fantastic vineyards, well established, but we like to give pleasure.
It's I think it's showing beautifully. And yeah, it's interesting. Someone made a comment, a friend of mine, Chris Tangi, said, hey, it's like Cape Cod. It's the Cape Cod. I said, well, it's better surfing. There's good surfing. As a surf, well, what I do now could loosely be described as surfing, but I certainly grew up doing it. And to be down there, to be able to go surfing, to be able to get off the beach, drink brilliant wine, eat fantastic food. Yeah, there are worse places you could hang out. That's for sure. I always get, and I'm getting it here a little bit, a little cashew sort of nut quality that comes through, not in a heavily roasted way. Maybe that's coming from lees and combination of oak, but I'm sort of seeing that a little bit. But yeah, but Marianne, tell us about the Montalto. It's 2016, and I'd love to get your impressions, because I don't have this wine. The Canadians have it, and you have a bottle.
Well, I'd love to hear from my fellow Canadians if they're lucky enough to be tasting what I'm tasting. Yeah, just to add on to what Oz is saying and to agree, certainly I feel like the Mornington Peninsula, like the Yarra Valley, which we'll be going to in a minute, was founded by people who were looking to make a particular style of wine. And there's a culture around Melbourne where there's a lot of really passionate somms and a big, a very sophisticated and fun eating culture that I think kind of created, and also people who live in Melbourne who want to have a weekend away at a wine region that's pretty close to them. So I think what really happened was, this kind of culture, the food and the wine kind of came up together at the same time. And because it's on a peninsula, that means there's water all around it, of course, which means less worry about frost, more moderate temperature changes. I am also, what I find so remarkable about this wine is how aromatic it is. There's just this whiff of white flowers or lemon blossoms in there. And, I think the wild ferment might be responsible for that. That really lets a some aromatic shine through in my experience.
Lovely comments for the Canadians I know that are just loving it, saying it's got a great sort of character and quality. And yeah, like you said, I think that approach to it is showing through. And I'm glad that it's showing well, because we like to have exactly the same vintages and exactly the same wines everywhere, but of course that's not always possible. And this was one of those situations, but we managed to navigate that really well. But good stuff. So Mornington, yeah, great region to visit for all the reasons mentioned. Strangely, though, it's 50% of what's planted in the Mornington, at least the most recent stats I looked at, it's Pinot. So it's become a great hotbed of Pinot Noir production, but Chardonnay is right there nipping at its heels, along with some other varieties dancing around the edges. But it's pretty much a Pinot and Chardonnay region, and yeah, a lot of benefits to trade. It's very easy to access, well, depending on the traffic out of Melbourne, but it's very easy to access. And honestly, if you're not charmed when you're down in Mornington Peninsula, you're probably dead from the waist up or something, because it's a tough place not to be charmed by. Beautiful stuff. Now we're heading back into speaking of regions that benefit from being close to a major city, Melbourne being Australia's second biggest city and close to sort of overtaking Sydney at some point in the near future, is the Yarra Valley. So about 45 minutes kind of northeast, you were in the Yarra Valley. Oz, were you going to be talking? I can't remember who's talking about the giant. No, that's you, Marianne.
Yeah.
Yes.
So as I mentioned, Yarra Valley, I think, is a reflection of both a movement towards regions to seek out cooler climates for cooler climate wines. It was founded by a lot of doctors and lawyers as well, where a lot of the pioneers. Giant Steps was founded by Phil Sexton, who founded a winery in Margaret River called Devil's Lair before that, and he also made a lot of really great beer. And Giant Steps takes its name from the John Coltrane album, for anyone who's a jazz saxophone lover. And yeah, he said people came to Yarra Valley to make this style of Chardonnay. Steve Flamsteed made this wine. He's kind of moving out of the Giant Steps project. Melanie Chester is taking over as of this vintage. She's a lovely gal. But one thing, I know we talked about this, Mark, one of the reasons why you wanted to pick this wine is because it's a regional expression, not a single vineyard. In fact, they make 5 different single vineyard bottlings of Chardonnay, and then they also make a wine that Steve would say is a jigsaw puzzle of all those vineyards together. And what that does is it increases production, it lowers the price, and it makes it more widely available for us. And we've been a big fan of this wine at Wine Spectator as well. I wanted to say that they produce each lot of the wine as it were individual wines. It's only at the end when they do some blending. When this regional expression comes together, all the fruit is handpicked, chilled overnight, which is a practice I'm hearing a lot more of among artisan Chardonnay producers. And yeah, only 10% of the barrels went through a spontaneous malolactic fermentation, which I think is kind of interesting. And they want to make sure that people know that this is not an entry-level wine by any means. It really isn't doing justice to the fact that they're growing really amazing grapes and bottling them in different ways. It's just full of energy. I have to say, Steve said that he really loves it with crispy roast skin chicken. If you ever want to talk chicken recipes, you should talk to Steve Flamsteed. I think we swapped about 8 back and forth in the course of 30 minutes. So, but yeah, absolutely. This is an absolutely wonderful food wine.
I thought one of the things, Marianne, about this was that it's 12.5 alcohol, and therefore it's the lowest alcohol in any of our wines today, and yet it absolutely has as much flavor as you could want. And I think back to 10 or 12 years ago when the Yarra Valley was leading the way in those wines that were often 12.1, 12.2, but really weren't drinkable. And now you've got 12.5 from an operation which absolutely understands that combination between I want to get to a large market and I never want to compromise on quality. And I think Giant Steps is a fabulous example of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And then to answer your question, Simon, they didn't suppress the mallow. It's just that they let the wine tell them what it wanted to do. It would be probably the way I would say it. And I think when we were talking earlier about the pendulum swing and kind of where it's kind of sitting in the middle, I mean, I think this is such a great example where there's such richness and fleshiness to the fruit flavors. I'm really sinking my teeth into that white peach and lemon, kind of curd or meringue. But at the same time, that acidity just keeps everything so much in focus. And I love the spicy details that are kind of hanging out in the background.
Yeah, and the peach is a good one because I think it's very difficult when people talk, well, what is the regional expression? I think Margaret River has something I think we can go, hey, there is a style and a texture and a weight, flavor profiles possibly. Yarra's all over the place because it depends where the fruit's coming from. There's the valley floor, there's mid, upper, and then there's the upper. Whereas this, one of the things I always try and look for when I'm looking for good quality Chardonnay and Yarra is that peach, almost like peach skin quality. And I think this shows it. And I also think from a price point perspective, this changes from state to state and overall. I think it's a great way. It is not an entry-level Chardonnay in terms of the quality that's gone into it, but it is not, you're not paying $100, $70, you're paying probably anywhere between $25 and $40 here in the US. And I'm not sure in the UK, I don't have the price of the UK in front of me, but you'll see it on the list there. But yeah, lovely introduction. And Steve, it's interesting, cooking recipes. Steve was a chef and he learned about wine because he bumped into Dean Hewitson in Beaujolais when he was over there cooking, which is a really weird, convoluted story, and thought, hey, I like this. I could probably be a winemaker. And he did. And I think that informs, as an ex-chef, that informs his decisions and the way he crafts his wines. I think it's kind of cool. So, but yeah, beautiful stuff. And I think, and we've shaped this. I mean, if you look at this, you would probably go, well, why didn't you start with the giant steps? Because it's probably the lightest. But that's not the point of this tasting. It was about sort of weaving the story, starting from more historical into more modern iterations. And I think, and I'm happy we did it in this way because I think that wine still shines for the character and quality that it's showing. Really lovely wine. Yeah, beautiful. Then we are on to, we're doing well for our timing here. We are on to Shaw and Smith. So we're into South Australia. South Australia as a state, most important wine producing state, produces, almost 50% of Australia's wine production. Lots of Chardonnay in South Australia. Most of it is for sort of fun, varietal, more sort of mass market wines. So not to be dismissed because there's a lot of really fun wines at that level. But when it comes to cool climate areas where high quality premium Chardonnays come from, there's no better place to no better lens to look at that in South Australia than through the lens of Adelaide Hills. Oz.
I think.
No, it's me again.
Oh, it's Marianne. Sorry.
Don't worry. We'll get back to Oz in a minute. I promise. Yes. So as you mentioned, it's a short drive from Adelaide. You pretty much go straight up the entire time, like you're riding a very slow roller coaster. And it's cool and wet in Adelaide Hills, and they kind of wear that with a badge of pride, to be honest. Shaw and Smith was established in 1989 by two very intelligent cousins. Michael Hill Smith was, of course, the first Australian to pass the MW, and Martin Shaw studied winemaking at Roseworthy and the University of Bordeaux. And I was actually there for Chardonnay harvest a few years ago, and I love how tight and tiny the little bunches of Chardonnay grapes were. It was like you could cup one in your hand and hide it if you wanted to. They were so adorable, and I think you get the intensity of flavor here. Michael Hill Smith did say that he notices a bit of reduction on the nose in this particular wine, which I absolutely get. I think it does add a level of intrigue and mystery to an otherwise, quite cheerful upfront Chardonnay this year. And he said 2020 was cool and difficult flowering, and the yields were particularly low. The loud cat is here, so if you hear some screaming, it's just Harriet. But yeah, I definitely get the intensity here, and think it's pretty terrific.
I think that reduction thing is something that it's worth talking about. It's something which has been a bit of a curse is too strong a word, but over the last 5 to 8 years, we've had far too much reduction in a lot of wines. People saying, "Oh, that's minerality." and one saying that's not minerality. You want to know about minerality? Talk to some people in the Mosel Valley, or talk to some people in Cote Roti, or probably several places in Australia. But don't tell me that carefully manipulated sulfides from large amounts of heavy lees shoved back into your barrels is minerality. It's certainly complexity, and I think that Sean Smith are very good at allowing that complexity to edge towards a word that I don't think we've used at all tonight, Mark, and I'm delighted we haven't, but towards what people think of as a Burgundian style of Chardonnay.
Beautiful.
Yeah, you're gonna have to put $1 in the
that's
swear
another
jar.
dollar for New Zealand, dollar for but sulfides, of course, are part of what makes things like Puligny Montrachet so interesting. But it's another of those things, like we're talking about earlier about, hey, we tried to make Burgundy. You don't have to. You have to try and make the best possible flavors of the place.
And that's a lovely point, because, and Christina Pickard, our friend from the Wine Enthusiast, is she's just made a comment here. The closest struck match reductive quality. What was happening it was that dial up to 11, because everyone's like, oh, we're trying to capture sulfides. And I remember with a group probably 7 or 8 years ago, young sommeliers, all smart, bright people going, I don't get this, and making one of the producers pull out an older wine to see where it was going to go. And that made sense, but it certainly didn't make sense when you were first getting it. It's like, okay, whereas I think now just a little whiff of that sulfide capture is probably a good thing. You see it in top Meursaults, you see it in top white Burgundies. But the reality is, and I think to the broader discussion, Oz, even in my time at Wine Australia, I've watched the change happen from producers, the better producers. There is not this, there used to be, we are making a Burgundian style Pinot or a Burgundian style Chardonnay or a Rhone like Shiraz. You'll still hear it, but a whole lot less. And I love that, because to me, that speaks of confidence. And I told Michael Hill-Smith I was going to use this line and not give him credit, but I'll give him credit because I think it's absolutely perfect. He said, inspiration rather than emulation is now the ticket. And I thought, that's perfect. That just completely sums it up, in that all the top winemakers, they know what's happening. They take their inspiration from the great wines, no matter what those varieties are, the great wines of the world. But that's not it. It's like, what can I do here now in the Yarra or here in Adelaide Hills to express better the fruit that's happening here? And I've watched this with Michael Hill-Smith's wines, and almost every year his wines have gotten better. And I've been watching them for the last 15 years. And it's like, that's a heck of a trick to play. And I think and a lot of that is confidence, and that's sort of, I think, what our wines are exuding nowadays. And these wines are a good example. They're not really trying to be anything else. I mean, we can find those exceptions. It's just, we're trying to be the best expressions of what we can do here in this site. I think it's a lovely point to bring up.
Yeah, I've been having a lot of conversations about Chardonnay in California recently as well. And that Burgundian, or the B word, comes up a lot. And I think it means a lot of things to a lot of different people. For some it's methods, for some it's a style. But the people that I relate to most is when they talk about it as an attitude, where, things are done at a relaxed pace. There's no rush. There's no chaos. That, they sit and have a proper lunch in the middle of harvest. They do things so that they're not overexerting themselves. And I think you can see that application in some of these Chardonnays, where they, instead of, doing 100 things to Chardonnays, well, maybe now they're doing 50, and maybe they're trying to get to 30, where they're doing less and less in the cellar, and, of course, more in the vineyard, but just in general, just trying to give those grapes their best chance to say what they want to say without interrupting them too much.
Yeah, and Simon Woods, who I haven't seen for a very, very long time, mentions Oak Ridge, and it kind of, a lot of that reduction discussion started with Bicknell at Oak Ridge. He was the big proponent of it, and those wines can be brilliant with the age, but sure, like you say, in the early days, that was always a bit of a struggle with the capture of sulfides. Man, it's got to be done very carefully. But I'm seeing a lot less of that, and then just much more cleaner expressions, which brings us beautifully and comfortably to a Tasmanian wine. And there is something about, talk about things rolling off the tongue languidly. Oz, Tasmania rolls off the tongue languidly, but boy, when you say the word, it's anything but languid. People get excited. There's something about Tasmania. It's raw, it's rugged, it's stunningly beautiful. I mean, if we were allowed to call it the Emerald Isle of Australia, I think I would, because it really has that sense about it. And there's just incredible excitement about it. And Toll Puddle has been a really interesting benchmark wine for a lot of young trade here when they started bringing this in a few years ago. But let's have a chat about this Toll Puddle wine. Oh, quickly, for the Americans, you were supposed to have the 2019 vintage, but there was quite the episode. You have 2020, so we'll try and get the details. Actually, for the American audience, if you want to download the details from one of the other, because the other markets have 2020, you can download the booklet from, say, the UK, and the details for the 2020 will be in there. The prices and everything will be the same, but the details. So yeah, there was just this last minute thing that legitimately happened last week. So we'll leave that if they want to learn. But anyway, Oz, please. Sorry.
And I think with Tasmania, it's easier to make a generalization about Tasmania. And Toll Puddle and the Coal River and the Huon and one or two other areas and the East Coast area around by Freycinet and people show that there's more than one Tasmania, because everybody knew that Tasmania was cool. But the general consensus was that it was also windy and wet. And in a lot of the wine areas of Tasmania, it is still windy and wet. If you go up on that stuff up towards the Bass Strait, it's windy and wet. And that's why some of the best sparkling material from the whole of Australia comes from there. And I must admit, again, talking to Michael Hill-Smith, he certainly viewed it like that. And he said it was until he had a dinner in 2011, not all that long ago, with the great Tasmanian pioneer Andrew Pirrie, and Andrew brought his computer to the dinner table, and he showed Michael and his cousin Martin Shaw, who they were out there together, that the east coast of Tasmania was dry, and it was even slightly warm, so dry and warmer, and the southeast, particularly the Coal River Valley, which is just above the capital of Hobart, right down in the bottom of the island, was just as dry as the east, a lot drier than the north and the rest of Tasmania, but it was also just a bit cooler than the east. So the cousins were over there, so they went to have a look at the east coast, and they liked it, but they thought it was an awful long way away from anywhere, and it is. I mean, where would you go for dinner for a start? I mean, they were literally thinking, where would you go for dinner if you're out on the East Coast? Nowhere. So
I could hear Michael Hill-Smith saying that, knowing what I know about him and dinner.
And that's with this in mind, they literally headed back to Hobart and thought they'd pop in to see this Toll Puddle vineyard, which is on the way to Hobart, partly because it was owned by their great friend Tony Jordan, Australia's sort of fizzy wine whiz. And they loved what they saw. This is a long, gentle, north-facing slope of mature Chardonnay and Pinot, and it wasn't for sale, and they weren't looking to buy. And within a few weeks, they'd bought it. It just got into them, and they thought, we have to have that. We have to have that. Luckily, Tony and Gary Crittenden were in the mood to sell. Now, the genius of the Coal River is that cool areas are also normally cloudy and wet, but just occasionally, in somewhere that really should be too cold and too wet to grow grapes, mountains and hills create a rain shadow. So it's still cool, but it's also sunny and dry. And that's just what happens with Coal River. The hills and the mountains north of Hobart, they fend off all the westerly winds and all those dark rain clouds. They just don't get over to the Coal River. So Coal River ends up getting about 500 millimeters of rain a year. And that is lower than any of Australia's other cool climate areas. I mean, it's half what they get in the Yarra Valley, and it is colder. Michael Hill-Smith doesn't call Toll Puddle cool. He calls it cold climate, not cool climate. And it is usually 3 degrees centigrade colder than the Yarra Valley. But the sun shines.
Well, it is a weird one down there. You know, it's actually wetter in the north because it's it's a bit more exposed in Tasmania, in that southern little section there. And I'm going to be back there in a few weeks, and I'm going to be spending a bit more time in Tasmania because I need to. I've only had a few things there, but it's cold. You got to remember, next stop, Antarctica, and nothing but cold ocean and a bunch of penguins. It's
but when the sun shines, and it does an awful lot, the grapes very slowly creep to ripeness on the vine. And I think the result is spectacular. But also, we're here talking about reduction as well. Now, one says that really the only two wines that have shown quite a lot of reduction today are the two Sean Smith wines. I think this one is so compactly, excitingly packed with flavor that we could say the reduction is another seasoning inside the wine, because there's quite a lot of reduction there. I mean, I'm tempted to give the glass a good shake, but actually I sort of think, but the wine is so delicious, I don't think it needs it. And I think it really is an example of this is a small, beautiful, brilliant new place. And you've got the just south of Hobart, you've got the Huon, which, when the frosts allow them to get a crop, is another fantastic new place. Australia's still finding new places, even in 2022.
Marianne, you've had some experience with this one.
Yeah, well, I was lucky enough to have a Zoom tasting with Ed Carr, the winemaker at House of Arras, which is amazing sparkling wine house based in Tasmania. Yes, right. Yeah, all praise to Ed. And it's funny, we were talking about all the subregions of Tasmania, and it's like, there's a lot of diversity there. There's a lot of excitement there. I think from the American perspective, Tasmania kind of captures our imagination because of the Tasmanian Devil cartoon. I hate to say it, but we as children, we have fond memories of hearing the word Tasmania. Unfortunately, not that many wines are making it to the States at this point. It did start with some sparkling wines. Clover Hill, I think, probably had the biggest influx, but yeah, we're starting to see these Chardonnays and Pinot Noirs, I should say. Toll Puddle makes a heck of a Pinot as well, and I think it's really exciting. And given our taste for cool climate, it's pretty fun to have this whole new playground for winemakers.
And to Waz's point, people sneaking down there to buy property. When I go down there, I'll actually be going with a wine producer who also makes some lovely wines in the Yarra Valley, a guy called Mac Forbes. He has a vineyard in the south, and he's up over in the Huon Valley. People in Tasmania say, "Oh, you're crazy. It's too cold." We'll see. He said, "I'll either be a genius or a fool. We'll see what happens." But he's planted down there, and I think that's where there is a genuine sense of excitement. And I think there is it's an entire island, and to call Tasmania, to sort of sweep it with one brush, is problematic because there are all sorts of subregions. They're not official subregions at this particular point. They will be, but I would still argue Tasmania needs to be front and center on any label, because that is a massive selling point to people, because that sense of sort of adventure just seems to come out with that word Tasmania, and I think it's cool. And we're just trying more and more wonderful wines. More and more wines are coming in, Marianne. We'll have a chat offline. I've got a few that I know are coming into the US in the next little while, which is exciting. Great comments in the chat, and wonderful to see that, because it does bring up subjects for us. I think I've answered, and we've answered any questions that necessarily were put into the Q&A. I think, and hey, maybe I'm seeing it through rose-colored glasses, but I think that was a stunning lineup of wines, and I'm absolutely thrilled with the way everything showed. I did not have full bottles. I had, the samples that everyone else did. And I hope for the audience that it's given you a nice little snapshot. But unless there's some other question, I might sort of final few words. Marianne, any comments overall? I mean.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm really pleased at how well these wines showed. When we were rehearsing, the idea of whether or not we can speak to a wine's regionality came up, and I absolutely panicked. I'm still very much a student of these wines, but I think what I'm learning more and more is that vineyards speak out, winemakers speak out. I'm not sure if regions are really speaking out as loudly as those things, and I think these wines are kind of confirming that a little bit for me. But what a great lineup, and some really different expressions. Thank you.
No, that's a great comment, actually. And I think if you look at certain wine styles, if you talk, say, Riesling, for example, not a lot of winemaking artifice for Rieslings. There is a Clare thing that shows through Eden Valley, maybe Tasmania. But you're right, certainly with a variety like Chardonnay, where what the interpretation that the winemaker takes, I think, is important. I do see some things in the background, but I would agree with you. I still think the site and the person that's sort of playing with the fruit and crafting the wine. Oz, anything to add?
Well, going back right to the beginning of the show, pleasure. These wines were just an absolute delight. I have to say, I'm really pleased. I haven't poured out all of my little sample bottles. I've left a little bit in each one because as soon as we've finished, I'm going to sit here with a great big smile on my face and quietly drink all 6. And my spoon is not going to be used as soon as we finish. I do think some regionality is starting to show. I think the Great Southern really showed some sort of particular regional quality. I think that the Coal River, the Toll Puddle, really showed some regional quality. And I think probably the Muraduck does as well, because Kate McIntyre is a very, very precise but laid back winemaker, letting that Mornington warmth and mellowness come through. So I don't think regionality was the most important thing showing today, but I think if we wanted to look for it, it is there.
Yeah. No, it's great. Christina also pointed out, which I didn't know, Christina Pickard, that's an all-female vineyard team in at Toll Puddle. Worth a mention. Very good mention. Thanks for that, Christina. Absolutely brilliant. We are even a bit early. Imagine that. Look at that precision in the timing here. I want to thank
Wait, before we go, can we just have Oz read the phone book to us until we
read the phone book? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Please. As it were a Shakespearean play, please. Thank you.
That's a great line. Thanks, Marianne. That's perfect. Lots of people to thank. The wineries, whenever we reach out, you have to remember we are reaching out to the wineries directly saying, hey, we need wine sent to these different places in the various corners of the world. So that's not a small thing to ask, and they always jump to it. So, and I think that speaks a lot to the sort of camaraderie and just the generosity of Australian producers. I mean, you can apply that to a lot of areas, but there's never any arguments. They look at what we're doing. They look at the panelists and go, yeah, heck yeah, we'll do that. So thank you to that. Thanks to my team who, I just get here and attempt to look pretty. But the reality is a lot of this work gets done in the background with my Wine Australia team. And I can't think of 2 people who I would rather have a glass of wine with at this time of the morning. Well, actually, I'd rather have it in the evening in person with you. At some point, that'll happen, hopefully in the near future. But I always seem to see you, Marianne, in mornings for coffee in Napa. And now I'm seeing you in the morning, but not coffee. Oz, you and I need to sit round the table and have a glass of wine at some point in the future, but I cannot thank you enough for the knowledge, the insight, the enthusiasm, and for you, Oz, the prose that you've brought to today's session. It's an absolute pleasure. And sometimes I pinch myself. Actually, this is work for me. I'm being paid to do this, which is really quite comical, isn't it? But thanks to everyone for tuning in. Thanks, Oz. Thanks, Marianne. And thank you all. And stay tuned. We'll do something global again in the near future. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
And not quite ending yet.